Greetings from the National Archives flagship building in Washington, D.C., which sits on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank peoples. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program about Scottish blockade runners of the Civil War. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about two programs coming up this month on our YouTube channel. On Tuesday, November 16th at 1 p.m., Gail Jessup White, a black descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' family, will discuss her new book, Reclamation, which explores her journey to understand her heritage. Historian Annette Gordon-Reed will join the author in conversation. And on Friday, November 19th at 1 p.m., Michael Burlingame will tell us about his new book, The Black Man's President, and discuss Abraham Lincoln's personal connections with black people over the course of his career. One of Abraham Lincoln's first acts as president in 1861 was to blockade the ports of southern states that had recently seceded from the Union. The blockade intended to deprive those states of the needed materials required to wage war. In response, the Confederate government, some states' governors, and private individuals purchased ships that would evade the blockade and bring in the needed goods. They looked to the shipyards of Scotland, particularly Glasgow, to obtain and fit out steamers. Joannes Wyllie, commander of the steamer Ad-Vance, was one of the thousands of Scottish sailors who ran the blockade of Confederate ports during the Civil War. Beginning with the story of Captain Wiley, our guest speakers will look into why so many Scottish vessels were involved in the conflict, even though Britain remained officially neutral during the American Civil War. Sources for today's story include Civil War prize cases files from the National Archives at New York City and Boston, which are available in our online catalog, and archival sources from Great Britain and the State Archives of North Carolina. It's now my pleasure to introduce our three panelists. John F. Messner, Curator of Transport and Technology at the Glasgow Museums and author of A Scottish Blockade Runner in the American Civil War. Stephen R. Wise, an expert on the blockade and author of Lifeline of the Confederacy. And Vann Evans, Audiovisual Materials Archivist, the State Archives of North Carolina, and contributor to Connecting the Doc, a podcast where archivists connect archival materials to fascinating true stories from the past. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, and welcome to today's session from the National Archives. My name is John Messner. I'm one of the curators of the Riverside Museum in Glasgow, Scotland, and also the author of today's book. From my accent, you might be able to tell that I'm indeed a New Scot, being originally from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've been here in Glasgow for the past 15 years and just about make out some of the mere-haired accents you can. I'm honored to be able to speak to you today about the life of Joannes Wyllie and the role that British blockade runners had in the Civil War with the invitation of the National Archives. Some significant items of research for the book on Wyllie came from the holdings, and it's a great opportunity to highlight these collections for other scholars and researchers. And joining me today to discuss British blockade running in the Civil War are Dr. Stephen R. Wise. Steve, in addition to being the author of Lifeline of the Confederacy, is also the director of the Paris Island Museum and an adjunct professor at the University of South Carolina. Steve has told me that he's spent countless hours in the National Archives, D.C., digging deep into the war records as part of its work on his book, which, if I might say, with a nod to our maritime theme today, by both depth and breadth, is a stunning example of historic research. I'm also joined by Vann Evans, who is the Audiovisual Materials Archivist at the State Archives of North Carolina. He previously served as a supervisor for Public Service Unit at the State Archive, advising and assisting researchers like myself. He first became interested in blockade running while taking a course on the subject by Dr. Chris Fonville, another expert in the subject, while a graduate student at UNC Wilmington. So I'd like to welcome both Vann and Steve. But before we get to the story of Joannes Wyllie, I'd like to ask Steve if you might be able to tell us what was the blockade, what were blockade running, and who is trying to run it?
Thank you, John. I'd like to go ahead and get started now and have the first picture to be shown of the blockade runner Alice. The short time allotted to me, what I want to do is give a general overview of blockade running during the American Civil War. Blockade running created a supply system based around very specialized vessels, and you're going to see pictures of these vessels as we go forward. That provided the Confederate armies with the means to fight their northern adversaries on equal terms. And what I like to sort of say, it gives the Confederacy, it gives the South the opportunity for victory. Now, at the start of the Civil War, no one envisioned the massive international logistical system that would evolve around blockade running. Now, initially, and you have to remember, the Confederacy, that we always talk about the Confederacy as an agricultural nation, was fairly well industrialized. And initially, the Confederate War Department planned to sustain its operation. I'm sorry? Initially, the Confederacy planned to sustain its operations through building their own munition plants. And blockade running would only be sort of a short-term stopgap measure, something that would fill the void between the depletion of existing stocks of arms and ammunition and the beginning of home production. But try as they might, the Confederates were never able to meet their needs through domestic production. They had to depend completely on blockade running. To carry out in the needed supplies, bring in the needed supplies. This is everything from arms, accoutrements, uniforms, chemicals, medical supplies, and even food. Confederate agents, for the most part, are going to primarily contract with private companies, mainly British firms, to provide necessary vessels. And since they had to deliver these goods by running through a federal blockade, the ships, their crews, their captains were termed blockade runners. Now, there are some exceptions. The Confederacy did operate a small line of vessels, as did a few states. John will tell us more about this side of the story. But the vast majority of the runners were operated by private, again, often British enterprises. This may seem like a bit of a tenuous setup for a nation that counts so much on foreign businessmen. But what's going to make it work is profit. And if I could get the slide of a cotton bond, please, at this point. Now, early on in the war, the Confederacy purchased 400,000 cotton bales for about $8 million. This is about $200 million in today's currency, to help out the cotton producers whose overseas markets had been cut off by the federal blockade. At first, they were not sure what to do with it. It was termed a white elephant. Then they quickly realized the value of cotton as a medium of exchange for the purchasing of supplies. Now, following the lead of the Navy Department, the government began using cotton to finance its overseas ventures. By employing the cotton purchased early in the war, the Confederacy began issuing, and you see a great picture of one right here, issuing cotton bonds, or sometimes called certificates. There were two ways to make a profit off the bonds. An investor could buy the bond at below par rate, collect interest on it every month until it could be redeemed at full value. Or, and this is what really makes things work, the investor could immediately make arrangements to turn the bond in for cotton. This particular bond, it's a $100 bond, could be redeemed in the Confederacy for 4 bales of cotton, which then could be turned around and sold in Great Britain for $1,000. It's the latter method that made the bond so popular. Cotton could be obtained in the South at 10 cents a pound, which would be about $2 today, and sold in Great Britain for 50 cents a pound, about $10 today. This making a bale of cotton purchased in Charleston for $50. This could be sold in Liverpool for $250. You can imagine how British businessmen viewed these extraordinary profits, and you might say, away we go. There was a wide variety of bonds, most issued by the Confederacy and some by a few of the states. The bonds were the basis for contracts between the South and its suppliers. Private blockade runners Their ventures used them to finance vessels, to guarantee outward cargoes. And with the British textile industry starved for cotton and willing to pay nearly any price for the fiber, blockade running was an extremely profitable business. For example, a blockade runner like this one that cost $100,000 to build could be outfitted and crewed for, say, $40,000. So say a firm puts $150,000 into its venture. If the vessel made it to the Confederacy, took out 1,000 bales of cotton, the firm would make $250,000, enough to pay for the ship and all overhead. Or in terms of today's money, a $3,750,000 outlay could bring you $6,250,000 gross profit. So we say such profit margins inspired foreign investors. Because of the fortunes that could be made, munitions, uniforms, uniform material, leather, medical supplies, accoutrements flowed into Confederacy on board steam blockade runners. Of course, you had to have the right vessel, a good captain, and a solid crew to successfully counter the Federal blockade. Early in the war, it was quickly realized that sailing ships would not do. Sailing ships large enough to carry a gainful amount of cargo were easy marks for steam-powered warships. So to counter their pursuers, the blockade runners also turned to steam engines. The first successful blockade runners were small, shallow-drafted packets like the one here shown. They're maneuverable, but they're not very fast, nor could they really carry a large amount of cargo. So as the war continued, so did the search for the perfect vessel. And soon a ship did emerge that became the prototype of all Civil War blockade runners. The class of steamer that came to be the model for blockade runners were found in the United Kingdom's coastal and cross-channel passenger trade. Since so many had been built on the Clyde River in and around Glasgow, Scotland, they were nicknamed Clyde steamers. They were rugged, fast, maneuverable, shallow-drafted, large cargo capacity. They were side wheelers. They were capable of carrying over 1,000 bales of cotton. And some of them have wonderful names, like this vessel here, which was termed the Let Her Rip. Also as important as the ships were the captains and crews. The sailors were usually foreign-born English, Scottish, and Irish. Captains and pilots could be Southerners who knew the coastal waters of the Confederacy, but many were also English and Scottish. And if you were successful, one could command a very handsome salary. Large cargo vessels will bring supplies from Great Britain to such ports as Havana, St. George, Bermuda, and Nassau in the Bahamas. The goods were then transferred to the smaller, faster blockade runners who delivered their cargoes to Confederate ports. The most popular runs were from Nassau to Charleston and Bermuda to Wilmington. During the Civil War, this is a little hard to believe to some, but it's true. During the Civil War, blockade runners were successful on over 75% of their runs. They had the advantage of speed and surprise over their adversaries, and most of the time they passed in and out unseen. Throughout the war, blockade running sustained the Confederate military. Because of blockade running, the Confederacy was never without the means to fight. The South imported 60% of its modern arms, 30% of its lead used to mold bullets, 75% of the Army's saltpeter required to manufacture powder, and nearly all the paper needed to make cartridges came through the blockade. The majority of cloth for uniforms, leather for accoutrements, and hundreds of thousands of shoes, as well as large amounts of metals, chemicals, medicine, and even by the end of the war, canned food arrived on blockade runners. The South never lost a battle due to the lack of equipment. While private ventures dominated the trade, the Confederacy, as well as certain individual southern states, operated blockade runners. The state that managed one of the most notable ventures was that established by North Carolina, which operated one of the war's most successful blockade runner, commanded by one of the war's most effective seamen, with both the ship and the captain hailing from Scotland. And with this, take it away, John.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that very concise description of the blockade. If we could go to image one, I'd like to just talk a bit more about British sailors and seamen, as well as captains and officers who were involved in running the blockade. It's estimated that 3,000 Scottish sailors alone were involved in running the blockade. And if you think some of these runners needed 50 or 60 crew, there'd be a large number needed not only for the running, but as Steve said, for bringing in the materials from Britain, from Europe, and depositing them in Nassau or St. George's. What we have in terms of evidence of it, there's a fantastic image, contemporary image from the Illustrated London News, which shows blockade runners on top of one of these British steamers running and invading the Union fleet. And if we could just go to image 2, I'd like to talk a little bit more about Liverpool and Glasgow at the time and how these were centers of industry producing these vessels. Glasgow and Liverpool are both maritime cities, and they had been kind of some of the centers for the Industrial Revolution in Britain. The first modern paddle steamer or steam vessel to be built in Britain, the Comet, was built on the River Clyde in 1812. And ever since that time, the 50 years following, the development of steam engines, maritime technology, and design had jumped by leaps and bounds. But also that relates to Liverpool, and Liverpool is there on the right of the screen. Liverpool has always been a maritime city. They were both involved in the construction of all types of vessels, from these coastal steamers to clippers, military vessels, tugs, and so on. So these are two of the main maritime ports in Britain. There are others, Bristol and the Tyne on the east side, and London. But when it came to blockade running and the vessels that were employed by it, these were the home of the majority of those that ran the blockade. We can just move to image 3, please. With that in mind, Glasgow Museums, my employer, we worked to think about how Glasgow's role in the conflict, the Civil War, had affected the conflict. And so in 2015, we decided, as part of the 150th anniversary of the conflict, to do a display about Glasgow's role in the American Civil War. And of course, primarily, this focus is on blockade runners. So the display features some of our fantastic ship models, and these were models that were from the actual companies that built the ships. So not amateur-built models, but these were models from the shipyards. And we have some models of the Giraffe, which became the Robert E. Lee, which was one of the most successful vessels. But we also have, right there in the center, a fantastic oil painting of one of these vessels, and that is the Ad-Vance. So I was working with our maritime curator, developing the displays, and one of the things that we find our visitors always like is to know some personal stories about the objects they see. So that could be who crashed on them, who drove them, who owned them, who designed them. And we have this fantastic painting, and the vessel is very well known, very well documented. But when I was doing the research for it, I noticed that there was a small plaque on it, and it mentioned the name Joannes Wyllie. So I very quickly consulted Steve's book and some other sources to try to find out a bit more about this captain, because it said he commanded the vessel. And it only turned out that it was kind of listed in maybe some footnotes, maybe very little was known about him. Sometimes it said it was English, sometimes Scottish, which was a very common thing to do even in today, to confuse the two. So it kind of set me off in thinking, well, we have this fantastic painting, but we don't know about the person. It'd be nice to know a little bit more about him before we finish the display. And if we can go to the next image, please. I was able to ask a colleague to put his name in the British Library's newspaper archive. And luckily, with a name like Joannes Wyllie, it came up with some hits. It came up with some hits right away that confirmed that he was indeed Scottish, that he was from an area of Scotland called Fife, which is on the east side of the country. And when he returned, he gave a number of lectures about his time as a blockade runner. And you see here on the right from the Fife Herald from December of 1869 is actually his first ever blockade runner lecture. And it turns out that these lectures, I was able to find a lot more about his time at sea, his life and background, as well, particularly for this topic today, about his time on the Ad-Vance. The photograph there on the left came with the painting. The painting, I should have said, actually was owned by Joannes Wyllie as well. This is the only known photograph we have of the man, and it was dated around 1862, just at the time he started his career on the blockade. So, looking through newspaper archives, both on this side of the Atlantic and on the American side, going through maritime records, crew lists, naval seaman records, really started to build up kind of a skeletal idea of who Joannes Wyllie was. His lecture listings gave a little bit more, but they were never fully transcribed. But if we can go to the next image, the source that really brings Wyllie's life to life, I should say, is an article that appeared in 1889 in a magazine called People's Friend. Now, at this point, I feel I should really digress and explain a little bit about the People's Friend. People's Friend, founded in 1869 and is still going strong today, was and is a magazine dedicated to female readers, to women readers. Initially, in 1869, it was more of a working class women's magazine. Today, if you ask any person in Scotland about the People's Friend, they'll say, "Oh yeah, my granny gets that, and she has it in her lounge. She likes to read it." So when I came across this listing of Joannes Wyllie and risen from the ranks, the great Scottish blockade runner, and started reading it, and luckily there's a copy that survives in the National Libraries here. It's full of some tall tales, some things you might call sailors' stories. We're talking shark attack. We're talking poisonings. We're talking love and adventure and romance, all of which sounds too good to be true. But the amazing thing is, once I merged these kind of stories with some of the primary source material from Steve Wise's book, from the crew lists and other maritime sources, it quickly became evident that although sometimes maybe with a pinch of salt you have to take, but all the stories were true. So it's a fantastic kind of what I call adding the muscles to the bones of the story. So if we can go to the next image, a little bit about Wyllie's life. He's born in 1828, and he's actually born in the Scottish Borders, which is down by England, but his family comes from Fife. His father was a gardener and a farmer. Early on, after the family moved back to Fife, and his father took up gardening once again. And he's from an area in Fife near Kirkcaldy, which is a large kind of county town, and also a maritime village called Dysart. And that's there up in the upper right-hand corner. Now, Wyllie's family, to my knowledge, didn't have any maritime connections. They were of the land. So he was going to go into basically farming. That was what it sounded like. But he showed promise, academic promise as a young man. And he actually was able to attend the University of St. Andrews. And that's an image of the university there. He attended there for several years. And then he took up a role of teaching in the area. So kind of a shaper of minds at one of the local schools dedicated to the children of miners. But in 1851, something happened. And we're not quite sure, but there was some kind of trouble because the teacher of the local school, Joannes Wyllie, was declared dead. And although he was very much alive, the local newspaper at the time ran a big story that the teacher was out at the pub one night, got drunk, fell over, and was crushed by a cart. Now, the People's Friend goes into this, and it kind of sounds like there's some kind of argument with someone else. Maybe over a woman, maybe over something like that. It's not quite clear. But soon after, Joannes Wyllie gives up his life as a teacher, and he goes to sea. He starts as an apprentice seaman, so basically the bottom rung of the ladder. And he spends the next 10 years sailing around the world from Australia, New Zealand, Africa, South America, and to Europe. And he rises up the ranks each time he can. So he goes to third mate, second mate, and first mate. And that's where, at that role, at that level, his connection with the war starts. And we can move to the next image. In early 1862, Wyllie is aboard a vessel called the Hope, which is a steam vessel. If we could just move to the next image. Cheers. And the hope was usually going back and forth from Liverpool to Europe. But it had been chartered to take 1,000 bales of cotton from Liverpool to New York City. And these bales of cotton actually come from the Confederacy, come from the southern states, and what Steve had just outlined. The war at this point wasn't a year old, but the cotton mills of New England, as well as the cotton mills of Lancashire and Scotland, were in desperate need of the raw material to make their wares. So these cotton bales had been run out of the South, had made it all the way to Liverpool, and now we're going back to America. So Wyllie is the first mate on the Hope. He very quickly finishes that voyage, and he's due to sit his exam to be a master. He does so, and his very first ship that he commands is the one here on the right, which was called the Bonita. Now, this image shows it as the Economist, because early in 1862, it had run the blockade of Charleston, and that's where this photograph, or this painting, I should say, shows. It had run the blockade and returned to Liverpool. So in between going to New York and getting on the Bonita, which had been renamed to try to fool the American spies and so in Liverpool at the time, Wyllie has definitely become part of this trade trying to run the blockade. The Bonita sails for Nassau and is going to run into Wilmington. But by the time it gets there in October of 1862, it's deemed to be too big and too slow to outrun the ever-strengthening blockade of Wilmington. So if Wyllie had intended to run the blockade that time, he'd been severely disappointed, and he had to come back to Liverpool with just the usual pay of a commander. And if we can go to the next slide, because on that return journey, his connection with the Ad-Vance begins. So on that return journey, there are two passengers that are sent by the recently elected governor of North Carolina. That's him in the center, Zebulon Vance. He was elected in the autumn, and one of his policies was to get into the blockade running trade for the state. So to not be dependent on privateers or companies that might not be bringing in the absolute necessities. He wanted to buy his own vessel. So he sent 3 agents over, and 2 of them are shown here. On the left is John White. He's a businessman. He's tasked to go over with these cotton bonds, sell them on, get the funds, and start buying the equipment. On the right is Thomas Morrow Crossan. He's the Navy man. He's the experienced naval officer who at the start of the war gave up his commission in the U.S. Navy, commanded some vessels for the Confederate and North Carolina Navy, and by this time he's sent over to find a vessel to become the North Carolina blockade runner. And doing my research on Wyllie, this is where it always comes that Crossan was in command of the vessel when it came over to run the blockade. If we can move to the next slide, we'll see that on all the official kind of documents and everything in the newspapers, Joannes Wyllie was listed in command. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is he's British, he's Scottish, it's a Scottish ship and Scottish flagged and owned. And one of the ways you can avoid kind of being captured is to plead your ignorance of the blockade and let the Union Navy know that, no, we're just going about our business. We're not trying to run the blockade. So he could act as a bit of a cover. But I also think that Wyllie, through the last 10 years of his maritime career, had experience with modern, up-to-date steamship technology. But Crossan was more of a sailman. He had been on some ships that were steamers, but not these kind of greyhounds at sea, which the passenger paddle steamers were called. And there was also a connection I failed to mention because John White, that businessman, he was Scottish, born in Kirkcaldy, so the same town that Wyllie's from. And it's not out of the bounds of imagination that these two families might have known each other. Well, as these 3 gentlemen were coming over back to Liverpool on the Bonita, one can only imagine what kind of conversations they were having about the blockade, about looking for a new steamer, because Wyllie, his very next command, his very next vessel, is the Lord Clyde, which becomes the Ad-Vance. And if we move it to the next image, we can see the only known photograph of the vessel during the war. So this is said to be taken in Nassau, 1863. So just at the start, of the Lord Clyde or Ad-Vance's start as a blockade runner. Now, one of the things they did, and Steve's images from the start showed this very clearly, is to start hiding themselves on the open waves. They were painted either a gray or light colors. They had lots of changes made to them, which made them be able to carry more cargo. For example, the Ad-Vance originally ran between Glasgow and Dublin and had a very fine first-class saloon for passengers. That's all ripped out so they can fit more cotton bales in, they can fit more clothing and weapons and other materials going in, and importantly, more coal in to make sure that the boilers and the engines never run out during a run. Now, the interesting thing to me is, you might not be able to make it out on your screens, but there's a group of men just on top of that paddle box. Some of them with a big burly beard, which Wyllie had at the time. Some of them with larger kind of mutton chop sideburns, which Crossliner had. So you can't really make out who's who. You have to think maybe one of them is on top of there looking out over to us. Now, if we go to the next image, talk a little bit about running the blockade and what kind of sources are out there that, one before that, please, that you can use to find out a bit more. So there's lots of newspaper accounts in the United States and Britain as well. Sometimes they could be a bit vague. Sometimes they could say materials were brought in. Sometimes they're very dedicated and detailed. So if you're looking to try to find any blockade runner, one of the places to go to is some of these newspapers. Also, the customs records in places like Nassau and Bermuda are full of information charting the ships going in and out, as well as Union Northern kind of councils who are there trying to see what's going on, letting the Navy know the most up-to-date information about some of these vessels. But for the purpose of looking at Wyllie and the Ad-Vance, probably the best place to find information is at the North Carolina Archives. So if we go to the next image, the North Carolina Archives have fantastic holdings, and specifically Governor Vance, Zebulon Baird Vance papers. And at this point, I'd just like to ask Vann if he can come in. Vann was an incredible help, and he's able to kind of tell us a little bit more about the archives for the start, please, Vann, and then a little bit more about the Zebulon Vance collection, and we'll go through some of them as we progress.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. So the State Archives of North Carolina is located in downtown Raleigh. We're located in the center of a lot of cultural attractions between the governor's mansion and the legislative building. And our roots go back to 1903 to the North Carolina Historical Commission. In fact, the first head of that commission was later appointed the first head of the National Archives, R.D.W. Connor, in 1934. And the Office of Archives and History, we form an important part of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, our parent agency, which takes care of things that people love about North Carolina, everything from A to Z, from the arts to the zoo, and so much else. Parks, aquariums, historic sites, archaeology, African American Heritage Commission, science and history museums, and the State Symphony Library and Archives, land and water stewardship, and more. And so all of these things kind of connect the people of North Carolina together. And in this case, they give us an opportunity to connect across the Atlantic to researchers and scholars in institutions like Mr. Messner's. Our primary mission at the State Archives is to collect, preserve, and provide access to historically significant archival materials. And if you can show us the next slide. That's our building here in Raleigh. And we are the primary repository for all state government agency or department records, including the governor's papers, the treasurer's office, the secretary of state, and the General Assembly. And we also collect special materials from private citizens and families that help supplement those government records. We are now back open to the public. If you can show us the next slide. And in the pre-COVID environment, this is a shot of researchers doing research on site. We've steadily opened back up, and we're currently open to the public Tuesday through Friday from 9 o'clock to 5, and on Saturdays from 9 to 1.
Right. Thank you very much, Vann. If you can move to the next image, Vann was able to provide a huge amount of kind of material that really starts to put a huge amount of detail and information into Wylie's career and the Ad-Vance's career. And I've used this one because this is a bill of exchange. Basically, it's a check. It's a payment. It's a paycheck to Wyllie. And actually, his first paycheck from the state of North Carolina, he was paid 230 British pounds. So this was one of the two paychecks, 54 pounds, 3 shillings and 4 pence, in the old money as we call it here. 230 pounds for work up to about August of 1863. So if you take into account the whole time in between its two vessels, that's about 8 months. And previously he was on £8 a month as a first officer. So it goes to show you that, as Steve said, that could be immensely profitable if you're successful as a blockade runner. And I'd just like to add that on the back of this, it's endorsed to Wylie's father back in Scotland. So he banked the first one. So he made sure that he had a little bit of money, no matter what else happened to him, a bit more going forward. If we can go to the next image, please. This is a great item from the John Julius Guthrie papers. And Dan, I just wanted to ask, the Guthrie papers are a private kind of collection. Is that right? Does it still form part of the Civil War kind of collections as a whole?
So that's a great question, John. We have an assortment of materials here, and what we refer to as our private collections. These are materials that were donated to us from individual persons or families. And I think in this particular case, the Guthrie papers came from, I think, a descendant of Guthrie, relatively early in the history of our organization. We do have a military collection of which we provided some resources to John, and that collection is more an assortment. We refer to it as an artificial collection, where it's a combination of materials that came to us early in the years of the North Carolina Historical Commission, of private materials that were acquired, or in some cases there were materials that were taken out of government agency records to try to make them more accessible to the public, since really scholarly researchers in particular, have always had a strong interest in the Civil War and the materials that we have here.
Thanks, Vanson. The reason why John Julius Guthrie is important to the story is Thomas Morrow Crossan, who was definitely on board the vessel and did have official command for some of the voyages. He was relieved of command, or he left command, and John Julius Guthrie, another American Southerner, took over for 2 voyages. And this is actually a crew list from one of those voyages. And I've blown up Joannes Wyllie's name. It's listed as first officer, spelled, so he wouldn't have been writing his own name that way. But it also lists their nativity, where they were born. That was one of the things that, if you're captured as a blockade runner, and if you're a neutral sailor, so from Britain or Europe or anywhere, you could be held for a short amount of time. The policy was then to release you, as long as you didn't fight back, as long as you didn't cause any havoc or prevent the Union vessel from capturing you. So a lot of these sailors who were British were able to claim that, and some of them, when the vessel was captured, I'll mention on the second, claimed to have some kind of British roots and to escape any kind of punishment. If we go to the next image, the archives are also full of a lot of these telegrams. This was to Governor Vance from Wyllie, talking about the Ad-Vance sailing in the morning, or loses the moon. These vessels tried to sail with the new moon to make it as dark as possible, to make it harder to capture. If we go to the next image, in December of 1860, Governor Vance, in order to not have all his eggs in one basket, sells half of the vessel to another company called Power, Low and Co. And then he can diversify his holdings and buy into some other runners. And what Vann was able to provide through the treasurer and comptroller papers is what are called disbursements. These are basically the outgoings of the vessel. Because now that it was state and privately owned, I think both parties wanted to make sure that they were both paying the right amount when it came to the costs of the vessel. And these are fantastic. Vann was able to provide several of these, and they go everything from listings, and this is from Bermuda, I should say, the medical hall for medicines, the pilot, C.C. Morris, a very experienced Wilmington pilot who got paid as much or more than a captain to be able to get the ship into the very narrow or shallow areas, a new Confederate flag, all the way down to washing, 2 pounds for washing for the crew. And you can see there at the bottom, Captain Wyllie, 208 pounds, 6 shillings, 8 pence. That roughly equates to $1,000. That's what he was getting paid for a complete voyage in and out. So 500 in, 500 out. If we go to the next image, there's some fantastic correspondence between Governor Vance and Wyllie himself. Wyllie officially takes over on the 29th of February, 1864. He'd been on the ship the whole time from it left Glasgow. He'd been known as either the first officer or sailing master. But by early March of 1864, it's him that takes over. This is a letter from Wyllie in his own hand to Vance telling him about the trip that he made out from Wilmington and basically how he was able to beat the other steamers, the Annie and the Lucy, because the Advance can make 18 knots, almost faster than anything out there. If we go to the next image, there's also some really interesting kind of, I wouldn't say quirky things in the files, but these are things that if you have a really good archivist like Vann and the people at New York and Boston and the National Archives, they can really dig some good stuff out for you. At the top is a letter from the purser of the Advance at the time of Wyllie's appointment to Governor Vance, talking about how the crew think of the change. And the crew are all delighted, but there's some outside feeling in the town about the idea of a foreigner, and that's how he writes it, foreigner, having charge of the gallant old craft. And then at the bottom, we have Joannes Wyllie's signature, which I was able to use on the cover of the book. So some fantastic little quirky things. If we just go one more image, please. One more letter. This is from another former purser and now an agent from North Carolina and England, saying that Captain Wyllie has done great for the ship and a better commander cannot be had for her. So you can see the kind of, although he was a foreigner, Scotsman, he was still gained that kind of respect from crew members, former crew members, and governors as well. I'd just like to ask Vann, if we can move on to the next image, just to tell us a little bit more about what researchers can look through your collections and what else is maybe digitized and how they can do some searching.
Sure. I'd really encourage researchers to, we continue to make our records available digitally. And if you visit our website, archives.ncdcr.gov, and go specifically to our digital collection, digital.ncdcr.gov, we have a sampling of our Civil War collections, our military collection, Confederate pension applications, and also our historical governor's papers, just to name a few. Researchers can also visit our doc catalog and search those collections. In the case of our governor's papers, so far we've made colonial governor's papers from the early 18th century all the way up to 1832 available. That includes the governor of Montford Stokes, who was the governor from 1830 to 1832. And we're gradually progressing to a place where we will get to, I think, the Zebulon Vance papers. One of the unique parts about the Vance papers, as I shared with John, is the volume of correspondence and petitions and material that are in the Vance papers really increase just because of the number of people who were in contact with the governor's office during his stint in office in the Civil War. So that will be quite a large undertaking. I was fortunate in the course of helping John to be able to make use of a microfilm publication that was created in 1987 and edited by Gordon McKinney and Richard McMurray, which attempted to index both by name and subject the governor's papers that the State Archives of North Carolina has, and also the University of North Carolina Southern Historical Collection and Duke University. And so that was a helpful tool for me to go try to navigate back to our governor's papers and letter books to supply John with the materials that he was interested in.
Right. Thank you much, Van. Can we just go to image number 20, please? So the Advance had been running for about a year. And this painting, this is the painting that's in our collection in Glasgow. It's painted by the famous maritime artist, English maritime artist, Samuel Walters. The Advance made another transatlantic trip in May and June of 1864 to get repairs to the vessel, actually quite considerable repairs when it comes to the money that was spent. So the governor and Power Low & Co. must have felt that they still had some time, and the war obviously was not over yet, to invest a huge amount of money into better machinery for the ship and cleaning for the ship, and hope that it continued to be a very successful vessel for the state. Now, at this point, it had made 14 runs in and out of the blockade. So Steve, at the top of the presentation, said one run could bring a huge profit to private companies. But this was a state ship, so it was bringing profit, but that was all being plowed back into these materials necessary for the regiments of North Carolina, as well as the people. But finally, ultimately, its luck ran out. And if we can go to the next image, on its way out on its 16th voyage, it's made another trip back into Wilmington. It was delayed in August and early September for various reasons, because it was too deep of a draft. It couldn't get over the sands. There was blockaders about. Wiley was actually ill for a while. And we know all of this because there's a fantastic diary written by Mary White. Now, Mary White was the daughter, teenage daughter of John White, that businessman who came over originally. He made his way back to North Carolina, and then he was taking his family over to England to continue his role. And Mary White's diary is a fantastic source. It's been very well known for years. It charts about a month's history about the Advance and its attempts to leave the Cape Fear River. And it's one of several personal stories and accounts that I included in the book, because as I've learned from my museum career, readers and visitors love to hear the personal stories. And see one of her entrants there at the bottom of September 2nd. They wanted to get out, but they spotted a large blockade runner. They had to come back, and they had to wait at Smithville. So she didn't make it on the vessel. John White and the family did not try their luck, because on the night of September 9th, 1864, the Advance, burning quite poor coal, that's the excuse, was caught up by the USS Santiago de Cuba, quite a slower vessel, something that should never have caught the Advance in any kind of real race. So it was captured, and what would happen then was these vessels were taken to the prize courts. And if we can move to the next image, the prize courts in New York and Boston, and that's where the National Archives come into play for my research, because both Boston and New York have the records for the prize court adjudications for the Advance. Wiley, being the commander at the time, was taken as one of 3 witnesses to appear in front of the court. And on the left, you have basically his deposition about all manner of means, who he was, what the Advance was carrying, and so forth. It's quite dry, trying not to incriminate himself. But also there's a huge amount. There's everything from invoices for towing the vessel. There's the original registry, which we saw before. Another crew list here on the right, which was taken in Liverpool, 1864. So a great wealth of information to try to put together history of the vessel when it was captured. But also an interesting thing. If we move to the next image, there's something called a crossliner. Now, I was told these are quite interesting. This was found in the mails on the vessel. So they carried mail back and forth. They carried post to Bermuda or Nassau, and then that could be taken to Britain. It could be taken to New York, anywhere. And this is an example in the mails. Doesn't have anything to do with the ship or Wiley, but as a cross letter. Because paper was scarce, one of the ways when you can write a letter is when you ran out of space, you can then go the other way around. So I'm told this is quite an interesting thing for archivists to see, and it's also one of those quirky things you might find. If we go to the next image, also a quirky thing is this on the left. It's a prescription given out to Wiley in Liverpool during that visit. And it's in Latin, like doctors or pharmacists would do at the time, but it's quinine, iron tablets, and nuncus vomicae. Basically, he might have been suffering from malaria, and he needed some iron tablets, and nuncus vomicae was a kind of a bit of a pick-me-up. So for a commander of a vessel, that might be very useful. Now, while he's captured, taken to New York, as a British citizen, he's released. And a lot of these sailors and officers did this. They'd be released, they'd come back to Britain, they'd get on another ship, or they'd get on another steamer in Nassau or the Bahamas. And he did that. He came back over to Britain. He took a ship out to Bermuda, and he became commander of the Deer, another blockade runner. It sailed, not for Wilmington this time, so a bit of a change, but for Charleston, one of the other major ports that Steve identified. The problem being, it tried to run the blockade on the 18th of February, 1865, which was the night that Charleston fell. Unfortunately, at least for Wylie's sake, and the ship's sake, it grounded, and the Deer was captured. Once again, as commander, taken up north to Boston this time, and this is the record of the auction made of all the things that are taken from the ship. So if you go to the prize court and a vessel is deemed a lawful prize, the ship, all of its cargo, all of its machinery can be auctioned off, and that money is then awarded to the people who bought the vessel. So it can be a very profitable trade for blockade runners, but also for Union Navy officers and sailors if they were kept. This just gives you an idea of what they were selling. So if we go to the next image, this is the end of Wylie's blockade runner career. He does have a few more years at sea, which kind of tells me that if he did make a lot of money as a blockade runner, he didn't feel the need that he needed to retire right away. So the next image shows a listing for one of these lectures. He comes back to Scotland, and he doesn't have a grand house somewhere. He doesn't build any land, doesn't buy any land. He retires to the farm that his father worked on. And for the next 40 years or so, he's a farmer, and he doesn't even own the farm. He's a tenant from the local Earl of Roslin. And a lot of these former blockade runners didn't tell their tale. There's only a few contemporary sources, maybe because they were on the losing side, maybe because they were gun running at the end of the day, although it should be noted that British-built weapons and arms went to both sides during the war. There's always a profit to be made in conflict side. So while he comes back, he gives at least 25 lectures. He becomes a bit of a local celebrity in the area, life, in that part, that his corner of Scotland. But that kind of fame and kind of notoriety or effects doesn't really travel beyond that. And that's why we're going to come back to the original kind of start of this story. There wasn't much known about Joannes Wyllie outside of Scotland. And if we go to the next image, just to kind of wrap up and hopefully get to some questions, what happened to him and what happened to the Ad-Vance? Well, Joannes Wyllie dies in 1902. This is one of 4 images we have of the man. At almost 73 years old, he retains quite a nice head of hair. I'd quite like to have that when I'm 73. This obituary, I think, is written by the same author of The People's Friend. It's very similar language. Obviously a man who in the area was a very well-liked individual. His lectures, I should say, were always in the aid of a local charity or someone falling on hard times. Other than the last one, which was a very big one for him, and all the money went to him and his wife. That once again tells me that maybe by the end of his life, if fortune had found him at the end of his blockade running career, it had not kept with him towards the end of his life. And what happens to the Ad-Vance? Well, like many other blockade runners, the poacher is turned into the gamekeeper. It was purchased by the U.S. Navy and became a blockader, so stopping blockade runners going in. It also took part on the assault of Fort Fisher, one of the forts guarding the mouth of the Cape Fear. It continued as a U.S. naval vessel. It was originally known as the USS Ad-Vance and then became the USS Frolic. And this is the Frolic in Naples Harbor, a bit later in the 1860s. It continued on in various kind of stations, North Atlantic, South America, and then was laid up and finally sold off and taken off the Navy lists in 1883. One of the things I was able to find is its ultimate fate. It didn't just get dismantled in 1883. No spoilers, but I'll just say it's quite not as famous as being either an Irish seafaring, a blockade runner, or a U.S. naval vessel. So with that, I'd just like to thank once again Steve and thank Vann for coming here today. First of all, for their help in bringing Wylie's story to light, but also giving this fine presentation, which really kind of gives a great overview of blockade running. Luckily, we have a couple questions. I'll ask the first one. Here's a question. It stated that 75% of blockade runners are successful. One, was this percentage for the duration of the war? Part of it, if one looked at the percentage of successful runs by year, did this decrease as the war progressed and the number of U.S. naval vessels increased? And this is all one question, Steve. I think this is good for you. If the percentage did decrease by year, how do you happen to have that percentage by year?
The percentage is based on the entire war, and by the end of the war, more vessels were being successful. Even though the North was increasing their number of blockaders, it was just the specialty, the style, the new vessels coming out of Great Britain, out of Scotland, out of England. They were just so spectacular, they could evade the blockade. It was earlier in the war that you start seeing a lot of these vessels, as you mentioned, with the economists, that they weren't made for blockade running, and they were easy prey for the federal blockaders. But it's an interesting race of technology, and an individual by the name of Kevin Foster has worked on this as well. That as the war goes on, these vessels advance so much in terms of their ability of speed and to be able to evade the blockade, that by the end of the war, they're still very successful.
Oh, thank you very much, Steve. There's another one here. I'll start out with it, but if you have something to add, I'd really appreciate it. And the question is, if Britain were in large part supportive of the Confederate cause, what was Britain supportive, and can you clarify? It's an interesting one. As Steve identified at the start of the war, the idea was to try to kind of hoard cotton and really cripple the British economy, because the British economy at that time was dependent on cotton grown in the southern states by enslaved peoples. So the biggest export of Britain was actually finished cotton goods, cotton cloth, and so on. So if you could deprive the mills of Lancashire and the west of Scotland of this raw material, one of the theories was that for economic viability, the British could come in on the side of the Confederacy. Now that could be anything from full-on military support, declare war against the United States. The Royal Navy would have made mincemeat of the Union Navy at the time, as well as possibly having a second front open up from Canada. So British regiments coming in from Canada. Now that never happened, and blockade running took off more, as Steve said, to be able to provide this kind of equipment. One of the other things is there was that support, and there was obviously support between shipyards, shipbuilders, ship owners, but there was also a very strong abolitionist and anti-slavery movement in Britain. Britain had officially gotten rid of slavery in its empire in 1834, although it depended on enslaved peoples in the South for the cotton. So there were very large movements in Glasgow, in Liverpool, and across the country who were always advocating for the British government to stay out of this conflict, do not support the southern states of the Confederacy, what they viewed as the continuation of the slavery which had been gotten rid of in the British Empire. Steve, do you want to add anything else to that?
Well, what specifically was the question?
Well, it was the question about kind of British support in general for the Confederate cause. And do you want to? Is there anything else you kind of add?
Well, of course, the British knew if you went to war, that was bad for business. But if you supported other people who were at war, that was very good for business. Well,
you know what, Steve? I think on that rather sad and more kind of honest note, frankly, I'd like to thank you both once again for coming along today. I'd like to thank all the staff at the National Archives in New York and the National Archives in Boston, who were incredible supporters for the research, as well as Vann and Steve. And thank the National Archives for hosting our presentation here today, And if you want to learn anything more about Joannes Wyllie or the blockade or the State Archives holdings, you can see the information there on your screen. And thank you very much and have a good day.